a couple of years ago at my wedding in this chapel, and I'm usually here in the morning minion. My grandfather 50 years ago was leading the morning minion all the time. And I'd like to welcome all of you to Congregation Shaarey Zedek. So now,
we're just going to twist this around a little bit. I want to wish you good afternoon and welcome. My name is Doreen Weisberg, and I am co-president and co-founder of MJAC with my friend, Ed Cole. And MJAC is just our acronym. We are the Michigan Jewish Action Council. I was going to say Ed had to be elsewhere, and he does. He's going to be leaving shortly due to important family obligations. But he does wish you all that you have a warm and meaningful afternoon with us. We both want to thank Congregation Shaarey Zedek for this wonderful facility and the following people who have donated their time and energy to making today's event a reality. Our Secretary, Ron Ross, and Treasurer, Mark Weisberg, MJAC board members, Eugene Greenstein, Harry Anico, Suzanne Sondheimer, and MJAC volunteers, Carrie Greenhut, Paul Mott, Judy Allen, and Ike Engelbaum. Thank you all. MJAC is just concluding its second year. We came together because of our local Jewish organizations that claim to represent our community, but represent a leftist progressive point of view, which we believe is inconsistent with traditional American Jewish values, and certainly does not represent our way of thinking. So we joined together because we thought we could do something about getting a Jewish and conservative perspective into the public arena. We'd also like to see the JCRC/AJC publicly acknowledge that they are not representing our segment of the Jewish community, and we invite them to refer to MJAC as representatives for these more traditional values, thus displaying that there is actually diversity within our population. So today's program was inspired by a three-part series that they have sponsored during this month called Destination America, Jewish and Muslim Migration, Histories and Trajectories. And it will conclude with the topic of diaspora politics on Tuesday at Wayne State University. In a moment, you will hear information that will not be presented on Tuesday. So, MJAC invites you to join with us to increase the awareness of and respect for Jewish conservatism. We also want to be a close community, a hub for people whose entire family or circle of friends may strongly disagree with our ideas. To that end, we have a WhatsApp chat group that is open to all our members. Let us know if you would like to join it. On the back of today's program, we have information about upcoming events and a membership form. If you'd like to join us today, while quantities last, we are gifting new and renewed memberships with a copy of Jonathan Newman's book, To Heal the World, How the Jewish Left Corrupts Judaism and Endangers Israel. Please stick around after the program for refreshments and a schmooze at the end. And as is our custom, we are now going to begin our meeting and events as usual with the Pledge of Allegiance led by Ron Ross and the prayer for the well-being of Israel and the Jewish people, the 121st Psalm. And our guest speaker, Daniel Greenfield, will be leading us reciting the 21st Psalm for us. So, Brenna?
Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
A song of ascents, Shir Malos. Esaranai Oharim, may I in Yavai Ezri. I will lift mine eyes unto the mountains, from whence shall my help come? Ezri Ne'im Hashem, Oshe Shamayim Haaretz. My help cometh from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Al Yitein V'Moika Glecha, Al Yanum Shamrecha. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Hine Wayonu V'Ishan, Shomer Yisrael. Behold, he that keepeth Israel doth neither sleep nor slumber. Hashem Shomerecha, Hashem Sucha Al Yadi Minecha. The Lord is thy keeper, the Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. Yom HaShemesh Hoyekecha V'Yareach Ba'layla. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. Hashem Yishmorcha Mikol Ra, Yishmor es Nafsecha. The Lord shall keep thee from all evil. He shall keep thy soul. Hashem Yishmor Tzeitzcho Bayacha Meyata V'Edaron. The Lord shall guard thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth and forever. Now this psalm is a particular favorite of mine. I used to have stress traveling in the past, flying from one part of the country to another, and I would recite this psalm whenever the plane would take off, and I found that inspirational today. I actually enjoyed flying.
Thank you, Daniel. You may sit down. And now, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Daniel to you. He was born in Israel and grew up in the United States. He began researching and eventually writing about Islamic terrorism after his experiences on September 11th in New York City. Since then, his work on Islamic terrorism, both in the big picture and in local cases across the country from Seattle to Maine, has been praised by leading counterterrorism figures, such as Daniel Pipes and Robert Spencer. His work explores the impact of Islamic terrorism on Jews in America, Europe, and Israel, the theological structure of Islamic terrorism, and explores the impact of Islamic immigration on the politics of tomorrow. So without further ado, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Thank you, everybody who made this happen, and everybody who just came out here. I am, as Doreen mentioned, a bit of a soft-spoken person, so if you're having trouble hearing me, just yell and shout. And as Doreen mentioned, there's a bit of a counter-programming here going on with talk of a shared future. Now, rhetoric is cheap. Everybody across the partisan divide can offer their own opinions, their own views, can put forward very compelling arguments composed entirely of rhetoric and not grounded in any kind of facts. What I hope to do here, actually, now, is to present to you very basic facts. Very basic, not just facts, but realities. Realities that are inescapable. Realities that you can't just ignore. Realities that can't be waved away with rhetoric, with words, with photos. I'm going to start by commemorating an anniversary that most of you probably don't know has occurred. It's the 7th anniversary of the worst attack on French Jews since World War II. It's the Mozart Torah massacre. Now, this massacre has gone largely unreported in the media. The media has made nearly no references whatsoever to the 7th anniversary of this attack. There have been references in the French media. In the American media, there was a brief AP story of about 100 words, which made no mention of the Jewish victims of the attack at all. On March, 7 years ago, it was the worst massacre of Jewish children since World War II, and it happened a few weeks after Purim. So this year, the anniversary happened a few days before Purim. In the original attack 7 years ago, it actually happened after Purim. Mohammed Merah, a Muslim terrorist, had been trained in Afghanistan, he'd been trained in Pakistan. He entered the Otsar Torah schoolyard. First thing he did was he opened fire. His first victims were a rabbi and his two sons, 2 and 6 years old, who were waiting for a bus. They were waiting for a bus right outside the school. He shot and killed them. The children who were playing in the Otsar Torah schoolyard. And I should backtrack a little bit and tell you a little bit about Otsar Torah. Otsar Torah means treasure of Torah, but it is a chain of schools that largely focuses on Jewish immigrants from the Middle East, from North Africa. That is to say, Jewish immigrants who fled the Muslim world. Under French rule, Jews for the first time in the Middle East and North Africa received equal rights. Before that, they'd been at best second-class citizens, or worse, even less than that. Under French rule, for the first time, North African Jews received equal rights. This is referred to as colonialism, by the way. There are still Algerian anti-colonialist activists who would denounce Algerian Jews for accepting equal rights from the French, because when you accept equal rights, you're clearly guilty of colonialism. And that really sums up the anti-colonial argument against Jews in an ugly nutshell. But in any case, these Jews fled violence, fled Islamic violence. They went to France, and the Islamic violence that they'd been running away from followed them and showed up in Otsar Torah. After Mohammed Merah entered the schoolyard, he targeted Miriam, who was 8 years old. She was the daughter of Moroccan Jews, of really a prominent family of Moroccan Jews. He cornered her, he grabbed her by the hair, he put the gun to her head, he pulled the trigger. At that point, a miracle happened. You might have considered it a postpartum miracle. There was this little 8-year-old girl with blonde hair, with blue eyes. He put the gun to her head, he pulled the trigger, the gun jammed. But he didn't give up. Instead, he switched guns, he shot her. Then while she lay bleeding and dying on the ground, he shot her 2 more times to make sure that she was dead. This is the 7-year anniversary of that event, which took place on March 19, 2012. And the story did not end there. This actually happened in Toulouse. What happened to the Jews of Toulouse afterward? They began to leave. They began doing what so many other French Jews, what Swedish Jews, what Jews in the UK, what Jews all across Europe have been doing. They began leaving. The Jewish deputy mayor of Toulouse actually said not long ago that 600 families had left since then and moved to Israel. Why? Well, this was not a one-time event. It was not an aberration. Because Mohammed Merah, after he killed an 8-year-old Jewish girl, he became a hero to French Muslims. He became such a hero that at least one baby was named after him. He became such a hero that there was graffiti all over Toulouse and other places in France praising him. He was such a hero that his name was referenced in Muslim hip-hop songs in France. And it's not just one man doing something ugly. Last year, the Imam of the Grand Mosque of Toulouse, which is absolutely the biggest and the most expensive mosque in Toulouse, he was caught delivering a sermon quoting a very famous hadith. This is an Islamic hadith, a teaching that appeared in the Hamas Charter. It appears in anti-Semitic Islamic invocations all around the world, and for that matter, in the United States. And it goes like this. You may have heard it. The Jews will hide behind the stones of the trees. Actually, it says that judgment day will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews, and the Jews will hide behind the stones of the trees, and the stones of the trees will say, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." This is not some sort of aberrant view. This is not an extremist view. This is a mainstream Islamic teaching. It is a very popular one. It was so popular that some years after the worst massacre of Jews in France since World War II, the Imam in the Grand Mosque of Toulouse felt very free and open to actually quote this. And as I go on, I will actually mention that this same teaching has been quoted in the last 2 years in mosques across America, in Houston, in North Carolina, and California, in major settings. It has been quoted and will continue to be quoted over and over again. Now, I'm beginning in Europe. And a lot of American Jews think that what happens in Europe is not really relevant to America. Now, I have a special perspective on this because I was born in Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. Then I actually grew up in Europe before coming to the United States. So every major city I've lived in has had a significant case of Islamic terror visited upon Jews. And you know what it's like actually growing up as a Jewish boy in Europe. It's not really like it is in the United States. The first thing you do is you don't wear any distinguishing Jewish clothing openly because you're putting yourself at risk. We're hearing more about this now, but this was exactly the way it was when I was growing up. It was that way in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 60s, which actually had major Islamic terror attacks on Jews that largely nobody paid attention to, that have been erased from history. Now, when I went to a Jewish school, the front gate, the school had absolutely no distinguishing marks. There was nothing there that would tell you this was a Jewish school, and that was by design. If you knew it was there, good. You were meant to be there. If you didn't know it was there, then you weren't meant to be there. The gate was huge. It was blast-proof. It was meant to resist a bombing. Inside was a former Israeli soldier, was very tough, and he sat behind bulletproof glass, and he would decide who could get into the second gate of the school, which of course was heavy steel and once again designed to be bulletproof, bomb-proof, and who knows what else proof. Children were released from schools in staggered sessions. They had no such concept as all the children running out to have recess. For the first time when I was able to do this was actually in the United States. Where I was growing up in Europe, you could not do that. Children would not have recess outside. They would have recess in the basement. They would not all leave school at the same time because then they could all be targeted at the same time. Now, if I was talking about this 10 years ago, it would be a completely exotic concept. But these days, it's not as exotic a concept as it used to be because, again, American Jews are increasingly coming to terms with the reality of terrorism. Now, these days, I actually live in Los Angeles after living in New York. It's one of the wealthiest and most successful communities in America. And the interesting thing about the synagogues of Los Angeles, almost none of them are entered by the front door. And if on occasion you actually enter them by the front door, you will have to pass by guards who have more firepower on them than you will see at an NRA convention. Now, this wasn't always that way, but it has become the norm. And it's becoming the norm for synagogues all across America. Synagogues all across America grappling with the question of how do we increase and improve security. And that was even before Pittsburgh. Now, the terror threat to Jews in America was driven largely by two vectors. One, neo-Nazis, obviously we're talking about Pittsburgh, and some previous attacks before that, and Islamic terrorists. Now, in the media, neo-Nazi attacks on Jews get attention, they get publicity. Muslim attacks on Jews and on synagogues don't. In some cases, they're actually downright excused. It's claimed that the perpetrators were entrapped, that they didn't really need to do it, that they were reacting in an oppressed form. And even more than that, there is a sense that these are two very different things. That when neo-Nazis attack a synagogue or attack Jews, it's an oppressive majority. Well, when Muslim terrorists attack synagogues, it's the outcry of an oppressed minority. And now this is actually something that happened in Germany not all that long ago. There was an attempt to firebomb a synagogue, and multiple reports just went ahead and said, well, this is a form of protest. It's not actually anti-Semitic violence. Just because they're tossing firebombs at a synagogue does not mean that they're anti-Semitic. They're just anti-Zionist. We hear a lot of this debate nowadays about the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. How do we figure out when somebody is really anti-Semitic? Maybe he's just critical of Israel. And you have this case where people are throwing firebombs at synagogues, and maybe they're just critical of Israel. And the Nazis, maybe they were just really huge anti-Zionists. They were very, very critical of an Israel that did not yet exist, but the Nazis were publicly opposed to Zionism, so who's to say they were anti-Semites? How do we even distinguish the borderline between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism when you can throw firebombs at a synagogue and still be considered anti-Zionist? But I'm diverging a bit here. When you actually contrast the difference between neo-Nazi attacks on Jews and Islamic attacks on Jews, they're motivated by fairly similar factors, and in fact, there's a good deal of overlap between these factors. And that's part of what I want to actually talk about. So, when you actually have leftists defending Muslim attackers who have hit synagogues, they will say that they were trapped, that the FBI really does not do a very good job of breaking up neo-Nazi attacks, but it does a great job of breaking up Muslim bombs. There's actually a very good reason for that, because really the most devastating neo-Nazi attacks on Jewish institutions have been so-called lone wolf attacks. And by that I mean there's one person, he doesn't tell anybody, he goes ahead and carries out an attack. Muslim terrorism tends to profile differently. You have multiple perpetrators. They try to recruit another person or other people. They talk about it to other people online who they think are working for ISIS. And that's how these plots get broken up. Now, when Muslim terrorists don't follow this model, you get some very devastating attacks. So, the Post massacre, you had one gunman, he didn't tell anybody about it, he just went ahead and killed people. What a devastating attack. Fort Hood massacre, again, one gunman, he didn't tell anybody about it, he killed quite a few people. And then what you have is something else, which is really close relationship terrorism. So the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston, they were brothers, they didn't have to worry about compromising themselves. As a result, they were able to carry out a successful, horrifying attack. And San Bernardino, Muslim husband and wife, nobody to sell them out, neither one was going to be an FBI informant. So they carried out a successful and quite devastating attack. The old adage is that two can keep a secret if one of them is dead. And that's what's been undermining Muslim terrorist attacks very consistently. The FBI has been good at stopping these terror plots, but it doesn't mean that they're not a serious threat. Actually, in January of this year, Hashel Joel Tareb was arrested by the FBI. That's January of this year. His targets included the White House, but also, something that was much less mentioned, his targets also included a synagogue. We don't know which synagogue. The synagogue was not named. The media chose not to dwell on the story, as the media usually chooses not to, as I will also go into. The Jewish part of such stories tends to be buried. For example, how many people know that the Boston bombers had previously murdered 3 young Jewish men? A few people know this, which is very good. You're very well informed. You won't hear about this much from the media. There's probably less than 10% of you who raise your hands. And it's not your fault. The media again chooses not to report this information. When you have Muslim violence against Jews, the stories get buried. Muslim terrorism in general doesn't get high profile. When you have an overlap between Muslim violence and Jews, the story gets buried. How many of you are actually aware that there was a Muslim terrorist who plotted a terrorist attack in Cleveland on the 4th of July parade, and that his targets, named by him, were Catholics and Jews? How many people are aware of that? Very good. But again, it's a small percentage of people, because the reality is the media does not dwell on certain information. Most people probably do not know that a Muslim terrorist plot against the synagogue was broken up in January of this year. The media focuses a great deal on neo-Nazi terror plots against Jewish institutions, not Muslim ones, but in fact there have been more Muslim terrorist plots, even in the last few years, against Jewish institutions than there have been neo-Nazi ones. In Pittsburgh, obviously, the result was a successful neo-Nazi plot, and it was quite devastating and horrifying. But if you look at the sheer number of plots that are broken up by the FBI, there are more Muslim terror plots than there are neo-Nazi ones. Again, December of last year, December 2019, Damon Joseph was a Muslim convert who was plotting to attack a synagogue in Toledo, Ohio. Again, his name was not mentioned. How many people of you have heard of this case? Very good. There are some well-informed people, but again, I'm seeing less than 10% of an audience, and this is an audience that came specifically to hear this talk. When you talk about the general public, how many in the general public are aware of this? And why aren't people aware of this? Why aren't people aware that just in December 2018, there was a terrorist plot against a synagogue in Toledo, Ohio? And here's a fun fact. We don't know which synagogue it was. Just as in Washington, D.C., we get very little information about the terror plots. The information tends to be buried. Now, there's an interesting angle to the Damon Joseph terror plot in Toledo, Ohio. And that actually goes to my point about the intersection between neo-Nazi violence against Jews and Islamic terrorism against Jews. So the interesting thing about Damon Joseph was, you know what his model was? His model was the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. This Muslim terrorist, who was a Muslim convert, took a look at the Tree of Life shooting and said, this is something I would like to do as a Muslim. And this was in the FBI report. I admire what the guy with the shooting did, actually, Joseph said. I can see myself carrying out this type of operation in Shaarey. They wouldn't even expect an attack in my area. And he told the FBI, I absolutely despise Jews. I have even before being Muslim. So here you have a case of pre-Islamic anti-Semitism transitioning to a case of Islamic anti-Semitism. And his plan was we would pick a synagogue, a place the Jews gather, scope it out, find all the exits and entrances. And there's an interesting case actually to be made for there being an overlap between neo-Nazi views and Islamic radicalism, Islamic radical violence. Again, this is actually last year. You probably haven't heard too much about it. How many people have heard about the sleepover stabbings in Jupiter, Florida? Doreen is very well informed. She is raising her hand for everything. This was These were sleepover stabbings in Jupiter, Florida, and you would think, considering the horrifying nature of the attack, you have a supposedly radicalized convert to Islam in Jupiter, Florida, who actually decided to hack to death on a sleepover the younger teenage brother of his friend and stabbed his mother also. Horrifying case, the sort of thing that you would think would go national, would go viral. It's a bizarre story, but no. And there's an angle that makes the story even more bizarre because actually the attacker was originally a neo-Nazi. And in many cases, they followed the attack under neo-Nazi violence. The ADL actually had this recent report about how neo-Nazi violence is rising. And the ADL decided to follow this guy, who very clearly stated that he had attacked this young boy and his mother because they insulted my religion, and it was not the neo-Nazi religion. Even though he had stated this, he had watched beheading videos, the ADL decided to follow this attack under neo-Nazi. This is a case of a guy who was a very bad person, who was a neo-Nazi, then he became an ISIS supporter. He's very horrible. There's no reason to pick and choose between neo-Nazi and Islamic terrorism, because at one point he was both. And we should recognize that there is an overlap, an intersection between neo-Nazi and Islamic violence. Many of you are probably aware of the story of Hitler's Mufti. But you know, a lot of the Nazis afterward, or at least some of them, particularly those who have been focused on the Muslim world, some of them actually moved to Egypt. They aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. They began translating the Quran. They converted to Islam. They began spewing anti-Semitism, this time as Muslims. So you have this kind of interesting overlap between two groups of anti-Semites that people think are actually contradictory, that people think there is a contradiction between being a neo-Nazi and a Muslim, and to some degree there is, but at the same time you have Islamic terrorists who originally started out as neo-Nazis, who originally started out in mainstream anti-Semitism. Obviously, neo-Nazis and Islamic terrorists disagree about a lot of things, but they both agree on hating Jews, and that was the basis for the alliance between Hitler and Hitler's Mufti, between various Islamists in the Middle East, including the Muslim Brotherhood, who saw the Nazis as actually doing wonderful work. And the Muslim Brotherhood to this day continues to actually cheer and support Hitler. You have Yusuf Qaradawi saying not all that long ago that the original Holocaust was at the hands of Hitler, but hopefully the next one will be at the hands of the believers. And by the believers, he means the Muslim Brotherhood. And basic reality is you have a long history of anti-Semites who seemingly have very little in common, finding common ground around bigotry. How many people know that the Nation of Islam and the KKK were actually allied back in the day? I seem to have stumped a few people here. You can actually find a video of Malcolm X and the leader of the American Nazi Party having a good time together. This actually completely happened. The KKK had a secret pact with the Nation of Islam, in which Nation of Islam mosques in the south would be protected, because the KKK and the Nation of Islam both agreed that integration was a very bad thing and that racial supremacism was a good thing. They disagreed on who was the master race. The Nation of Islam believes that white people were created by a Jewish evil mad scientist named Yaqub or Yaakov, and that UFOs are going to come down and blow everybody up. And you know, the KKK had their own grand wizard stuff going on. But when it came to bigotry, when it came to the general idea that there is a supreme race, they were agreed on that. So the reality is that they did actually have a lot in common. Over in Europe, Anders Breivik, who's been described as an anti-Muslim extremist, in practice, if you read through his manifesto, he actually talked about allying with Muslim terrorist groups to carry out terrorist attacks for them in Europe. That's also the bottom line here. You have bigots from across the spectrum who can agree on hating Jews and on attacking Jews. So we should absolutely remember the Pittsburgh Trio by shooting. We should also remember the Seattle Jewish Federation, where a Muslim terrorist shot 6 women, using a teenage girl as a hostage. Now, in the last 2 years, as I mentioned, we've dodged a number of bullets. We won't always be so lucky. So when we start talking about a shared future, let's talk about the risks in that shared future. Let's talk about all the bullets that we won't be able to dodge. Now, to actually be able to quantify that risk, we can look at a number of factors. Our best test laboratory for seeing what an Islamic future, an Islamic Jewish future, an Islamic Judeo-Christian future in America will look like is Europe. Because Europe consists of Western countries that are at least somewhat similar to our own, which actually gives us a base to work from. Now, obviously there have been a variety of surveys measuring anti-Semitism. Now, personally, I don't want to dwell too much on measuring anti-Semitism, because too much of that is speech control and speech monitoring. There are a lot of people who are bigots. Arguably, everybody is a bigot in some way, and we have a free country, which means you are free to be a bigot. What I'm concerned about is not the people who necessarily have bigoted views. What I'm concerned about are the people who actually take action and turn those views into reality. So now I've given you some examples of recent Islamic terrorist plots aimed at Jews in the United States. But as I mentioned, Europe is really the ideal laboratory because in Europe you actually have a growing Muslim population that is actually larger than the Jewish population. So what does that actually look like? Now, FBI hate crime data in the United States are potentially a great resource, but the FBI hate crime data dwells very much on the victims of attacks. So they're really good for nailing down where Jews are being targeted with anti-Semitic violence. They don't tell us anything about who's doing it and why. We actually do, however, have a survey from Europe that actually tells us some very useful information about this. And this came last year from the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And it actually is not a survey of people who hate Jews, which is often what we see. We have surveys, what percentage of the population holds anti-Semitic views. Those are views. This was a survey of Jews who experienced anti-Semitic harassment and violence, and it asked them what the source of the anti-Semitic harassment and violence was. This was the largest survey of Jews in Europe at the time. This was last year. So the survey said that Jews experienced 30% of anti-Semitic harassment from right-wingers, 21% from left-wingers, and 30% from Muslims. Now, to put that into perspective, it means that 50% of anti-Semitic harassment of Jews in Europe is coming from Muslims or the left. Or, put another way, it's anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. This is huge, and it actually tells us what a shared future in the United States risks looking like. Now, in Germany you would expect to actually have some of the worst right-wing anti-Semitism, and there were elevated numbers of right-wing anti-Semitism. 21% of the anti-Semitic harassment in Germany was indeed coming from right-wingers. Germany does have a viable and vibrant neo-Nazi movement, but 40% of the harassment in Germany was coming from Muslims. This is why the leadership of the Jewish community in Germany has been coming out more and more about the dangers of Islamic migration into Germany. These people are not right-wingers. They're not bigots. They're not Islamophobes in the way that the media likes to paint. They're people who generally have a fear of Islam because they're seeing the violence that is taking place. They're seeing the harassment. They're seeing the physical assaults. And when you have statistics like this, which show that 40% of the violence in Germany, anti-Semitic harassment in Germany, is coming from Muslims, that is a very troubling statistic. It's a statistic that should make us think twice about the cost of migration. It's certainly making Jews in Europe think twice about the cost of migration. Now, nonetheless, when you're on the left, you tend to think in terms of oppressed and oppressors. The right-wingers, they're oppressors. They're the majority. While Muslim immigrants, they might be conducting harassment, but they're the oppressed minority. And the oppressed minority should be sympathized with, even if they're engaging in anti-Semitic harassment. But there's a fundamental mistake there, and this is really what neo-Nazis and Islamists have in common. Neither of them thinks of themselves as a minority. They think of themselves as the insurgent branch of a majority, a so-called silent majority that is waiting to impose its will on the country, on the world. They're supremacists. Supremacists don't think in terms of minorities. Supremacists believe that they are superior and that they should be able to impose their will. Islamist groups are very openly plain-spoken about that. Neo-Nazis are obviously also very plain-spoken about that. So much like the KKK and the Nation of Islam, you have two sets of supremacist groups, both of them anti-Semitic. And supremacists tend to be anti-Semitic because if you believe you're superior, well, the Jews are a very obvious target for being the Untermenschen. The evil people who keep you down, who prevent you from exercising your natural superiority. And Islamic anti-Semitism, it's not that of a minority, but of a majority that is temporarily a minority. Recently, we had the entire controversy with Representative Omar with her anti-Semitic statements, and the defense was, well, she's a member of a minority group, she hasn't properly adapted to the United States. Well, it's true she hasn't properly adapted to the United States because in theory we're supposed to oppose anti-Semitism in the United States. But where did Representative Omar get her views from? She came out of a majority Muslim country. She came out of a majoritarian society where it's taken for granted that Jews are bad. It's taken for granted that Jews are bad because that's what the Quran and that's what Islamic teachings say. This is prejudice. It's the prejudice of the majority, not of the minority. It's majoritarian bigotry. The left insists that Islamic anti-Semitism in Western countries is fundamentally different from Islamic anti-Semitism in Muslim countries. that when you have Muslim anti-Semitism in Saudi Arabia, it's very different than when you have a Muslim immigrant in America being anti-Semitic. These are two very different things. But the reality is most Muslim immigrants to the United States are coming from majority Muslim countries, which means the cultural anti-Semitism that they're bringing with them, the theological anti-Semitism that is coming with them, is not that of a minority. It is not that of people who see themselves as an oppressed minority, but as people who see themselves as a majority that is being prevented by a vast conspiracy, and I'm not making this up, of Jews and Freemasons and the Rothschilds, international bankers and the CIA, from having the kind of authority that they really should have. I mean, this is classic Nazi ideology, and this is actually has influenced a lot of modern Islamic bigotry, their obsession with the Freemasons, their obsession with the Rothschilds. It's all very conventional stuff. So there's been a lot of crossover between neo-Nazi, supremacist anti-Semitism and Islamic anti-Semitism. And the basic reality is that while a lot of people try to reduce Islamic anti-Semitism to Israel, to 1948, Islamic anti-Semitism that is being put out there, I just recently quoted the Hadiths, those date back far, far, far before Theodor Herzl, before 1948, before Zionism was even any kind of recognizable movement. Islamic anti-Semitism dates back almost to the very founding of Islam. It is an ancient idea. And when Representative Omar's original anti-Semitic comment was urging Allah to wake the world up to how Israel had hypnotized the world, and this is theological anti-Semitism. It's not political anti-Semitism. There's a call to Allah. There's the conviction that the Jews are actually manipulating the world. This is classical anti-Semitism, but it's also theological anti-Semitism. It dates back to the central idea of Islam when it comes to the Jews, that the Jews are manipulators, that the Jews are actually able to control people, that the Jews are constantly working against Islam and blinding the world to the truth of Allah. And this dates back to the basic conflict. I mean, where is the origin of Islamic anti-Semitism? It's not Israel. Muhammad did not hate Jews because of Israel. He did not hate Jews because of the West Bank. He did not hate Jews because there was Jewish housing in Jerusalem. He did not hate Jews because of the Six-Day War. Muhammad hated Jews for a very simple reason. It's a very traditional anti-Semitic reason. The Jews had failed to accept Islam. The Jews had failed to accept him as the prophet. As a result, the Jews had to be damned as liars, as manipulators, as the primal enemies of Islam. The term actually, Allahu Akbar, the phrase dates back to Muhammad's original attack on the Jews. And it means that Allah is supreme. He is greater than the God of the Jews. Because how that term came to being was that Muhammad and his forces were advancing on the Jewish population. They had taken them by surprise. The Jews were actually busy gardening. They were bringing out shovels. They were preparing to plant plants in their oasis. And the armies of Islam were coming. And Muhammad cried, Allahu Akbar. Clearly, Allah is supreme to the God of the Jews. That's the central idea there. We're told often about Abrahamic religions, but in practice, Islamic theology does not recognize the Jews or Christians as being equivalent to Islam. They vary between being dhimmis to being mushrikeen. And mushrikeen means basically polytheists, idolaters, and the Quran doesn't need to accuse Jews and Christians both of worshiping things, of making partners with Allah, which basically means that they're idolaters and that they really have no rights whatsoever. You can prove both points of view from the Quran, which of course is very convenient, and makes the Quran very indispensable to everybody trying to prove anything at all. The bottom line is the Islamic anti-Semitism is not based on the question of who gets a few miles of Israel here or there. It far, far, far predates Israel. When we go right back to the conflict between Judgment Day not coming until the rocks and the stones tell the Muslims, here's a Jew, come and kill him. This is widely used today, but it was widely used before. The idea that the Jews are the primal enemies of Islam is not a political idea, it's not a territorial idea. When it was coined, the Jews had no territory. It is a theological idea. And that is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with it as theological supremacism. And until we recognize that, we will have absolutely nothing meaningful to say about a shared future for Muslims and Jews. The Hadith, the same one that I just mentioned, it was quoted, allegedly, by Hakam Bazian, who was the co-founder of Students for Justice in Palestine. He went ahead and quoted the Hadith. Recently, it's become quite popular in the United States. A mosque in Philly just this year was actually forced to apologize for an imam quoting the Hadith. And as usual, it was forced to apologize because the Hadith ended up on video, and there was controversy in the mosque who claimed, we know nothing about this, we don't know how this happened, we are very tolerant, and of course the ADL went ahead and said, of course, we're very tolerant. We don't know how this happened either. A mosque in Houston quoted it in 2017 as in a mosque in California. Last year, 2018, a mosque in North Carolina was again caught preaching the same hadith. Why is this hadith so popular? Because it gets at the idea that there is an eternal, timeless war between Jews and Muslims, that Muslims represent good and Jews represent evil. And it's important to remember that as we get mired in all these debates about Israel. What should the Israeli government be doing? What should American Jews be doing to argue about Israel? Anti-Semitism predates Israel. It very certainly predates the entire idea of Zionism. Anti-Semitism is based on the premise that Jews are projected to be evil, and that the people who are projecting Jews as evil now allow themselves to believe that they are good because the Jews are evil. This is the origin of anti-Semitism. It's the origin of Islamic anti-Semitism. And no matter what kind of deals Israel makes or doesn't make with terrorists, no matter how badly these deals fall apart, and they're bound to fall apart, the bottom line is this kind of theological anti-Semitism has been around for over 1,000 years. I'm going to take a very good bet, and I wish I was wrong. I'm going to take a good bet that it's going to continue being around. It is not going anywhere. And that means we have to learn to understand how to live with it and how to live with the consequences of it. It means that when we have Islamic immigration in America, that will mean the import of views such as these. It will mean the growth and the rise of anti-Semitism. This doesn't mean that all Muslims are anti-Semites. It doesn't mean that all mosques are anti-Semitic. But it does mean that there is a large anti-Semitic legacy within Islam, and that as a result, this is something that we're going to keep seeing again and again. And even if only 10% of a population not only hold hateful views, but are willing to act on them, it doesn't have to be a terrorist attack. It can be spitting on you in the subway. It can be shouting an insult at you. It can be just pushing you down the stairs, as happened to my friend a few years ago. All it has to be is harassment, sustained harassment. That's what it was when I was growing up in Europe. We did experience a horrible Islamic terrorist attack, but for the most part, we didn't face terrorism. What we faced was sustained harassment. And when you have sustained harassment, it becomes unlivable. The Jews revert to the kind of situation that they were in the ghettos, where they have to form very tight-knit communities, where they have to be careful of the outside world, where they don't feel like they belong, that they're a part of society. And that is also what we're seeing in the entire debate with Representative Omar. The sense that Jews are not really American. The sense that Jews don't actually belong here. And that is what a shared future of Jews and Muslims really looks like. It's a future in which Jews do not have equal rights. In the Muslim world, Jews were not exterminated. Jews were persecuted, they were oppressed, they were deprived of rights, they were often killed, certain rules were imposed on them, rules that actually forced them to live as inferiors, including wearing a badge. The concept of the yellow star arguably has its origins in the Muslim world. Jewish synagogues could not be higher than those of a mosque. There were various reminders that Jews were inferiors. That's what a shared future looks like. When you have a shared future with Jews and Islamists, then it's a future in which Jews are forced to maintain an inferior status, in which Jews are forced to apologize for their religion, for their way of life over and over again, in which Jews feel marginalized. And that is what is awaiting us. Now, the various arguments about a shared future is that Muslims and Jews have a lot of things in common. You know, it's true, Muslims do have things in common. Islam is based on Christianity and Judaism and various other religions that were popular at the time. The thing is, in the Middle East, having things in common is not necessarily a good thing. On the way here, I was actually in an Uber driven by a Maronite Christian from Lebanon who had gotten out because Hezbollah has recently taken over Lebanon. He discussed just how miserable it was. Now, we're not talking about somebody who is Jewish, who is a member of another group. He is a fellow Lebanese Arab who at the same time happens to be a member of another religion. But we don't have to go that far. In Syria, going across the region, Shiite and Sunni Muslims who have so much in common, they technically share a religion, are killing each other. And they've been killing each other for quite a lot of centuries. Because even though they have quite a few things in common, they don't have enough in common. When you have a lot of things in common, it's sort of like family in some ways. It actually feeds the hatred. When you have 90% in common, you focus on the 10% of things that you have not in common. And it's a very tribal impulse. The closer you resemble somebody who actually believes that their way is the only right way, the more they will hate you for that. The more they will hate you because you're 90% of the way there. Why aren't you the other 10% of the way there? And you know, this shouldn't be that mysterious to Jews because, you know, Jews tend to have a lot of internal conflicts also. Jews naturally split into different groups. There's always the shul, the synagogue you don't go to. The difference is when Jews get into fights, what do? We go to another synagogue. We create another synagogue. The joke is that when the temple splits up, the original temple is Temple Bet Shalom, and the other temple is Temple Rodef Shalom. Now, that's what Jews naturally do. Jews naturally fragment and they splinter. They create another temple, they create another synagogue, they create another religious movement. In Israel, they create another political party. Israel had a taxi drivers party at one point. It's got the LA Arok, which is the marijuana party. So Jews naturally just splinter, they splinter more, they splinter some more. This is our strength, but perhaps it's also our weakness. Muslims, on the other hand, strive for unity. They don't tolerate dissent, they don't tolerate splintering. That's why Islam has a huge number of followers, but it has fewer schismatic movements than most normal religions would, because what happens when you actually break away from Islam, when you try to create your own way, is they will kill you, which means that you have the largest dissenting Islamic movements are in the United States, they're in Europe, they're actually in Israel. The Baha'i movement has its roots in Islam. It's largely safe in Israel. It's not going to be safe in the Muslim world. You have the Ahmadiyya who often market themselves as peaceful Muslims. And, you know, they generally are very peaceful. What they don't mention to people is that they're a tiny splinter group, and that in Pakistan, their lives are at risk. So, of course, they operate largely in the UK and Canada, because there they can safely be peaceful Muslims. You can't be peaceful Muslim in Pakistan. It won't end very well. So, Jews tend to splinter, fragment. Muslims strive for a physical, political unity. Jews believe in something called Tishbi Yukarit's Kushas Vavais, which basically means that at some point God is going to say who's right. For now, we're just going to go our own way. Muslims believe that we, or rather they, are the agents of Allah, who actually have to determine what is right and wrong. It is their job to enforce the right and prohibit the wrong, which means when there's a dissenting breach, they're not just going to let it go. They're going to kill those people, because that is what Allah wants of them. Allah wants them to enforce His will on earth. And that is where Islam is very different than Judaism. It's very different than a lot of other religions. It's very different than post-Enlightenment Western world, which says we're going to tolerate different points of view. And that is, again, the difference between majorities and minorities. Minorities want tolerance for different points of view. Minorities want to be able to say, we're going to disagree with you, we're going to believe in a different God, we're going to think somewhat differently, and that's going to be okay because we're a minority. Now, majorities want it to be their way or the highway. And Islamists in the West, they very much act like majorities. Heads of groups like here will openly say we are here to actually bring Islam to America. We're actually here to make America a Muslim country. Are they actually going to successfully do that? It seems implausible right now, but then again, the idea that the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, would become a Muslim territory, that Constantinople would become Istanbul, would have also seemed very implausible. I can't predict the future, but what I can do is tell you what these people actually do believe, what they assert, and what they want to accomplish. And when ISIS originally set up shop and managed to seize power over 8 million people, that was extremely implausible. They did it because nobody stopped them. This administration, fortunately, has stopped them. But that's the reality. When you don't stop the bad guys, then you can have an Austrian house painter who actually ends up taking up over most of Europe and killing millions of Jews. When you don't stop the bad guys, you can have people who outwardly seem a joke, like the Bolsheviks, taking power and nearly destroying the world. When you don't stop the bad guys, then you can have the same situation that we're seeing now in Europe, when Jews are being forced out, when they're being driven out, and when nobody will talk about it. Now, people will say that the European experience is different than the American experience, which is true, but here's the thing. The Muslim immigrant populations that are coming to America and to Europe, they are largely the same. They're coming from Muslim-majority countries like Pakistan, like Somalia, like Egypt, like Morocco. They're coming to these countries with a worldview which says that Jews are bad because Muslims are superior, because Islam is superior. And if Islam is superior, if Islam is the only right way to live, then it goes without saying that there must be something wrong with Jews, because if there wasn't something wrong with Jews, why aren't Jews Muslims? That's the fundamental question here. Now, we've had again the controversy with Representative Omar. What makes Representative Omar hate Jews? There are no Jews in Somalia. I'm not sure there were ever Jews in Somalia. Probably at some point there were Jews passing through Somalia. Where did Representative Omar pick up anti-Semitism? The simple answer is that she picked it up from the Quran, she picked it up from theology. That is the carrier, that is the vector, and that is the source of the problem. So whatever happens in Israel, whatever doesn't happen in Israel, Islamic theology is the vector for Islamic anti-Semitism, which means that none of that is going to significantly change. Now, right now, American experience of Islam is different than the European experience of Islam. There are two reasons for that. Part of it is demographics. The number in Europe, Muslims outnumber Jews. In America, they do not yet outnumber Jews, but the demographic tipping point is indeed approaching. The second reason is that actually you see these numbers of how many Muslims there are in America. A sizable percentage of America's Muslim population is still African American, which has a different culture, a different history, a different worldview. As you increasingly see the growth of a Muslim population from majority Muslim countries, you're going to see a different relationship between Muslims and Jews. Now, the demographic tipping point is already approaching in some ways. You notice the entire controversy about 2020 Democrats turning on Israel, refusing to come to AIPAC. Why is that happening? Well, one of the reasons that's happening is that Jews in America tend to live in pretty much safe Democrat states. Jews in America live in New York, they live in California. Their votes are, in any case, pretty much diluted there. On the other hand, Muslims increasingly live in swing states. They live in places like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. And that actually makes them politically influential. They live in places like Virginia and Florida, which actually, again, puts Muslims more and more into the driver's seat in national elections. Now, locally, in local politics, Islamic influence is still weaker, but that is going to change, again, as demographics increase. The bottom line is, if you have a population where even 10%, even 1% is extremely anti-Semitic, this is going to fundamentally change the position of the Jews in America, and it won't change it for the better. If you have 10,000 people who are violently prejudiced against Jews, and if you increase that population to 100,000 and then to 1 million, the end result for Jews will be worse. There will be more terrorist attacks, there will be more harassment, and of course Jews will increasingly lose political power. Now, right now, there's still room for interfaith activity between Jewish and Muslim groups because Muslim groups are still a kind of minority. Again, as the Muslim population grows, Muslim organizations are going to have less and less use for Jewish organizations, which, as a practical matter, means that a lot of the interfaith that exists now will go by the wayside. Now, why don't the Jewish establishment organizations understand this? There's a fairly simple reason. If you look at a Muslim organization, the odds are very good that the Muslim organization like Shaarey Zedek takes the Quran, takes Islamic teachings very seriously. They believe in the literal truth of their scriptures, of their teachings. The average Jewish establishment group does not believe in the literal teachings of the Torah, does not believe that the Bible is a literal source of divine commandments. It believes that it's an inspiration. It's something that has powerful spiritual messages for all of us, but it doesn't believe that when the Bible says something, you're actually supposed to do it 100%. Muslims do believe this, and this creates a fundamental gulf of misunderstanding because the reality is Jewish establishment groups do not understand how their Islamist opposite numbers think. They don't think that they actually take their religion seriously because they don't take their religion seriously. So they assume that their opposite numbers in Shaarey Zedek aren't really serious about this. That they view the Quran as having some sort of spiritual inspiration, but not that they will actually look at a hadith that says the day of judgment will not come until the Muslims kill the Jews and the rocks, and the Jews will literally say, there was a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Now, how literally do Muslims take this hadith? In many of these cases that I quoted where imams were preaching this, they quoted this made-up story in which Prime Minister Netanyahu says, we know the story is true, and that's why we actually are trying not to plant garka trees, which is supposed to be the tree of the Jews, and the garka tree in this hadith will actually, it's the boxthorn tree, the boxthorn tree, by the way, this tree will actually not inform on the Jews. So they will actually believe this is a literal truth. This is actually something that will happen. And this is very unfathomable for really Westerners, for particular liberals, because it's not how they think, it's not how we think. Islam actually believes in the literal truth of its scriptures. The Westerners who underestimate Islam, who misunderstand Islam, don't believe in the literal truth of their scriptures. And thus they are actually unable to comprehend the threat, they are unable to comprehend the problem. They assume that when Muslims reference the Quran, that they are just viewing it as inspirational. And their arrogance is wrong and foolish. Islamists are not seeking a shared future based on anything other than the past. That is what to be an Islamist means. It means believing that there was a perfect time under the rule of Muhammad, under the rule of the divinely appointed caliphs, in which society, at least Muslim society, was ideal. They want to restore that. ISIS is the most extreme example of that, but every Islamist movement is based on the idea of perfecting society through Islam. Nearly every Muslim country has a constitution which says that its laws are based on the laws of Sharia. Because again, they believe that the ideal society is an Islamic society. It is based on the laws of Islam, not just the teachings, not just the values, not just the virtues, not just the spiritual inspiration of Islam, but the literal laws of Islam. This is what they want to recreate. And if you look at the history and the events in the Middle East, in North Africa, around the region in the last 50 years, that's where the trend has been. Islamic societies have been rising. Secular societies have been falling more and more. If you look at Turkey, which was once upon a time a secular stronghold, is now an Islamic stronghold. Iran, again, was once quite secular. You can look back at the famous photos of girls in Afghanistan wearing miniskirts who are now wearing burqas. The trend has always been toward Islamism. Now, we may think that we are immune from that. Europe really shows that we are not. Europe shows that there is Sharia police. It shows that there is a growing number of Europeans who actually join and fight for ISIS, for Islamic terrorism. And by the way, we're not just talking about Muslim immigrants. We're also talking about Europeans who convert to Islam because they find Islam's message compelling, because Islam actually believes in its doctrines. Islamic preachers actually believe in the truth of what they're saying, whereas many liberal clergy do not. And thus they actually join Islam, they join ISIS, they become terrorists because they actually find it convincing. So we have two possible approaches going forward. We can try the shared future, in which we hope that somehow history in America will function differently than history in the Middle East, will function differently than history in Europe. It assumes that we are somehow immune from history, that if we are optimistic enough, if we are positive enough, if we are airy-fairy enough, that we will somehow get a pass on history, that things will come out differently in America than they have everywhere else, that the same history that happens everywhere else will not happen to us. Now, I prefer a fact-based approach. I prefer a historical approach. We can only determine what a shared future will look like based on what a shared past and what a shared present looks like. We can look at a shared past. We can look at a shared present. Pardon me, this tells me that I'm going a bit over time. Thank you. Well, I can keep going for another hour then. I believe that the best way, as Patrick Henry said, to measure the future is by the past. It's actually looking at the facts, it's looking at the surveys and the studies, at the statistics. It's looking at the situation of Jews in the Middle East, what few of them there are outside Israel. It's looking at the future of the Jews in Europe. So one option is to believe in a shared future based on nothing at all except optimism that is not grounded in history or facts. Another is to actually look at who we need to be and look at resistance. Now, I would propose that we actually begin not looking at a shared future, but looking at a Jewish future. In Israel, Zionism began not because we were looking at a shared future, but because we had despaired of a shared future, because we said, perhaps there will be a shared future, perhaps we will somehow overcome anti-Semitism, but for now, let's actually look at a Jewish future. Let's look at what a Jewish future should be. Let's look not at how we can get along with everybody else. Let's look at how we want to get along with ourselves. Let's look at what a future for us will look like. And that is what I propose to do. I'm not proposing that we all move to Israel. I'm proposing that as American Jews, we actually take a look at what our future, a Jewish future, would look like. And to begin, let's start believing in ourselves. Let's remember our history, both past, the distant past, and the recent past. Let's honor our dead. That includes an 8-year-old girl, an 8-year-old Jewish girl named Miriam, who was brutally murdered 7 years ago, and her faith is largely forgotten. Her faith is largely forgotten outside France. There are schoolmates of hers who were in the schoolyard that day. They're teenage girls now. They remember her. They talk about what a special life she had, how amazing she was. Her father, a rabbi, came forward and said that it had been 7 years, approximating the 7 victims. The prayer for the dead was recited, and it was recited under a heavy police presence, because that's the only way you can have a Jewish event in France. France has been in a state of emergency for years now, as is Belgium and a number of other countries. A state of emergency means that there are actual soldiers outside synagogues in France. It means that the only way that Jews can feel even a modicum of safety and security in France is under heavily armed guard. Imagine a situation where Jews in America actually not only have to have private security, but have to have soldiers, have to have the Marines outside synagogues. If you think it can't happen, it's actually happening already in Europe. Let's think about what the shared Jewish future, the shared Jewish-Muslim future in Toulouse looks like, where most of the Jews have left. And let's look at the kind of Jewish future that we want. problem is not just that Muslims hate us. The problem is that we hate ourselves. The problem is that we lack confidence in ourselves. The problem is that we don't really properly believe in ourselves. We can't even think about a Jewish future. We think about a shared future with the people who hate us. Islamic anti-Semitism is ancient. It goes back to the 7th century. Our own crisis of faith, and it is very much a crisis of faith, is much more recent. It's a modern crisis. It's a crisis that has torn the Jewish people apart. It's a crisis that pits people like yourselves against the Jewish establishment, that insists on rejecting all the evidence around it, just as it rejected all the evidence around it in the run-up to World War II. Terrorism is the consequence of our own lack of self-confidence. You can either terrorize the physically weak who can't defend themselves, or you can terrorize the morally weak. We, and by that I mean Americans, Jews, and Christians, have been terrorized by Islamic terrorism because we've become morally weak. And by morally weak, I mean we lack the confidence in our own rightness, in our own future. We lack a faith in ourselves. And our best defense is faith. Faith in God, faith in our own traditions, faith in our religions, faith in our country, and faith in ourselves. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. You're going to say a few remarks. I just wanted to say how meaningful that has been to me and hopefully to everybody here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Harry Anko. I'm an MJAC board member, as Doreen pointed out earlier. I do most of the postings on the MJAC website. This is one of the few times I've been let out in public. I hope I do well. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out to listen to Daniel Greenfield and supporting MJAC. Mr. Greenfield has been doing important work, reporting stories that don't fit the standard mainstream media narratives. You can find his reports on Front Page Mag and on his own blog, Sultan Knish. Okay, good. And I do recommend both of these sites very highly. I'd like to thank Daniel Greenfield for speaking to us today and for the investigative reporting he does. And if you go to Sultan Knish, you will enjoy some clear, intelligent writing that makes it easy to understand the issues that he addresses. I read your most recent post, your Forum post, I believe from a couple days ago, and I will be linking to that on our website because I think it's really important. It's really good. Thank you to the MJAC Setup Committee and the Food Committee for preparing the snacks that we're going to enjoy when we leave. Thank you to Congregation Shaarey Zedek for allowing us to use this space on what was kind of short notice. Thank you, Doreen. Doreen, you can't believe how much work Doreen does putting together these programs, doing things for MJAC, which by extension is doing things for all of us, including people who aren't members. Please join us. What's our next program? I was going to say, please join us for our next program.
We are going to have an activist training, grassroots activist training, in the end of April, right after Passover on April 28th. And it's a full-day workshop with a kosher lunch included, and we get a great discount. And you'll see more information about that on our website and emails coming soon.
And then I'd like to say shalom to Rona Ross, who's going to Israel in a few days with the Volunteer for Israel program. And check the brochures for membership details. I'd like to invite everybody to join. As you heard, we bring in speakers who go against the officially approved voices and the officially approved thoughts, which I think, especially these days, is really important. Thank you again. Shalom.
We're going to move into the question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question, we ask you to please line up over here, and then we'll take your questions.
I'm a Sherman journalism fellow at frontpagemag.com, and I also blog at Sultan Knish. And I will promise to take your questions, but I won't promise to give them back. That is most welcome.
2014 that President El-Sisi of Egypt said at the Islamic Seminary that we need to have a reformation because we can't keep telling the world we're going to kill them if they don't believe like we do. Meanwhile, the cops don't seem to have it any better in Egypt. You have some comments on where El-Sisi is really at?
Well, I was promised a very insightful question, and you don't disappoint. Egypt, like a lot of countries, has different tiers of authority. The government only has so much power, and in practice, various institutions in Egypt have far more power than the government does. And El-Sisi is very much marketing himself to the United States. He's marketing himself to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is basically financing his government for the most part. And the practical reality is, if there were major riots, then this government would fall, just like Mubarak's government fell. Now, much of what actually brought down Mubarak's government is not the myth of the Arab Spring that we've been fed. The myth of the Arab Spring is that people wanted democracy. In practice, this was about subsidies. It was about price hikes in the cost of wheat and the cost of gasoline, which is subsidized in Egypt. Once those went up, you had major riots, and those riots were passed on to by leftists, by Islamists, and the result was that this narrative was created of a push for democracy. Sisi knows quite well that if there is a major outcry by the general public, the Islamists will jump on that again. Their political allies in the West will jump on that as well, and that his government will fall. So he's going to make certain noises about protecting Christians, about enforcing laws, but there's only so far he's actually going to go. Please.
Why can't this country get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood, care with Muslim funds for federal groups and massive? I don't understand.
Well, during the Bush administration, there was actually something called Operation Green Quest, which was on the way to doing this before it was completely shut down. The short answer to your question is basically the Obama administration, which shut down investigations of a lot of Islamic groups. And now there's a kind of a slow, gradual tilt upward, but there's just so much distraction, and the FBI has been so badly tainted after 8 years, and the various enforcement agencies have been so badly tainted, that expecting them to actually do this job is unrealistic. There's a whole generation of agents that actually have no idea what this even is, and they understood this back in the Bush administration. The training materials were cleared out. I mean, there's a lot of people who probably read about this already. I will say briefly that a push to actually list the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization is really important. If it actually were to even make waves, they'll also be forced to defend the Muslim Brotherhood, which they have done before, and it actually forces a conversation about this, which we very much need to have.
There's a video I got from this Clarion Project.
Yes,
About,
they do great work.
yeah, and there's a lot of imams and preaching, killing Jews, in mosques around the United States.
Yes.
Did a lot of stuff. How is Congress
Well, in many cases, the video is actually taken from the mosque websites, from the YouTube channels. Memory, for example, has done a great job of taking them and transcribing them and putting them up. And there's no serious argument that these videos are real as far as the imams in the mosque. That said, there are fake videos that are occasionally planted, and that is a problem. That's it, not really these videos, but sometimes people will specifically misattribute, and they will put their own things on videos. But you can just refer to major sources. You can look back at memory. Memory does not post fake videos. Sir?
Michael Taylor. I was wondering what you have to say about, I think that your comment that we need to be proud of our heritage and who we are, but there's a lot of people like the Jewish Voice of Peace. They use their identity as a weapon, and I just wonder what if you had some comments about that.
Well, that is a great question. The thing is, what they use as Jewish identity is not pride in Jewish identity. Instead, they're ashamed to be Jewish. They will reference bits of Jewish scripture, for example, but when you actually get down to it, they will say that the Torah is a bad thing. I mean, it's racist, it's colonialist, it's sexist. They will say that Jewish identity is terrible, Israel is terrible, the Jewish community is terrible. What part of Jewishness are they actually proud of, is the thing to ask them. Please. more the merrier.
What we all know what's happening with Christians in the Middle East and all over being attacked, but why primarily Jews? Why not Christians with the Muslims as strongly against this as they are against the Jews? That's my first question. The second question is, growing up in the United States, I was aware as a youngster before World War II of anti-Semitism, the Ku Klux Klan, the Catholic Church sometimes, not the Church, the Catholics, and anti-Semitism. Why so much Muslim anti-Semitism now when there wasn't then?
Well, those are two questions, which is quite reasonable. At 3, I start getting confused and I have to ask you to repeat things. So, as far as why there's more Muslim anti-Semitism, it's because there's more Muslim migration to the United States. You didn't have a large Muslim population back then. You do now. You had a very small, initially it was mainly Syrian and Lebanese Christians who were coming to the United States, people like Danny Thomas, who were Christians. Muslim migration really kicked off much later in a much more contemporary time, and it took a while for there to even be a significant Muslim population in the United States. And really, largely, we've only had a major Muslim population after September 11th, which is very perverse, but that's the way it is. As far as why Muslims hate Jews more than Christians, so Muslims do hate both Jews and Christians, but Jews are seen as the original enemy of Islam for a number of reasons. One, that Muhammad attacked the Jews first, way back in the 7th century. Another reason is that a lot of Islam takes from both Judaism and Christianity. But if you look, for example, at the list of Muslim prophets, it's Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, goes down through the list through King David, King Solomon, and of course it takes a detour through Jesus. But the majority of those prophets are Jewish, which means they have to displace Jews in order to take over Jewish history. They also have to displace Christians, but it isn't as urgent because really a lot of what they've taken is what's called the Old Testament, the Torah, and so they have a special hatred for Jews because of that. Sir?
What's your prediction for the French Jews since the Muslim population is about 10% of France? Within the next 10 years, you're going to see Jews
The Jews are leaving, and this is a point they touched on briefly. So a lot of French Jews are not really French Jews. They're Jews from North Africa. They're Sephardim who actually escaped Muslim persecution to come to France. They're already leaving. They're already being forced out. Some are fighting. But the bottom line is that the majority of French Jews are already Jews who were refugees to France, and so they're now moving on to Israel, they're moving on to Montreal, to other places, because France is becoming increasingly unlivable for Jews, will become increasingly unlivable for everybody. But Jews are the canary in the coal mine. It affects Jews earliest, when you have bad air, and the bad air of Islam is affecting Jews quite badly in France.
probably the next 10 years.
Within the next 10 years, I think the French Jewish population will dwindle dramatically. It already is year by year. And
How do the Europeans feel about when they want to be
it
American?
varies, just like Americans. There are those who are on the left who think it's a great idea. There are those on the right who think it's a bad idea. There are people who are neither on the right nor the left who have their own opinions. A lot of people just get their news from the media and they will say, well, you know, I mean, it's diversity. We have more kebab shops. That's part is great. We have a bit more violence, but we should really talk about it. I mean, most of the population doesn't really have strong political views. They get things from the media, they pick up things, they repeat them, they don't think about them unless something actually happens to them, and then sometimes people wake up.
Italy.
Yes. Ma'am?
Thank you. I was wondering if you'd done any investigation already, study of something called the interfaith movement here. I guess because of our proximity to Dearborn and a lot of Muslims here, and me being a Christian, we have had some more liberal Christian denominations and some Catholics all get together and play kumbaya footsie with them saying we all have this in common. I think it's insidious. I just wondered what your comments were on that.
Well, this is kind of what I was talking about. It's a deeply corrupt situation. It's also deeply coolest. You generally have left-wing groups doing this, and they view Muslims as allies for them on all their left-wing positions, even though that really makes no sense because Islamists are obviously anti-gay. They're not particularly big fans of abortion either. They're not really with them on most social issues, but they're considered an oppressed minority, and so as a result, they see them as members of the same team. This is obviously delusional, but they're thinking short-term, not long-term, which is our politics in general. Yes. Sir?
I've always adhered to the premise that maybe 1%, 1.5% of Muslims are terrorists, but 99% of them have hatred for Jews because of their upbringing. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, the percentages are more complicated than that. There are secular Muslims. There are people who are very militantly anti-Semitic. There are people who support certain tactics but not other tactics. So it's going to vary a lot. But the bottom line is that the majority of Muslims find jihad to be a fundamental tenet of Islam, and they believe that it has to be practiced under some circumstances. They might disagree on the which circumstances, but you have a sizable percentage of the population that says there are circumstances under which it is appropriate to suicide bomb people, under which it is appropriate to bomb buses, to plant pressure cooker bombs. That's not a livable situation. It's not a sustainable situation. Okay, I'm told that we're being kicked down a window to reception. But there are snacks there to make up for it. And I will be happy to discuss with you and take your questions there.
Doing so much.